The rain poured heavily, mixing with the blood trickling down Jake's face. His vision blurred, his body ached, and his legs trembled under his weight. He could barely hear the roar of the crowd anymore, just the pounding of his own heart. His coach was shouting something, but Jake couldn't make out the words. His opponent stood across from him, fists clenched, breathing heavily but steady. Unlike Jake, he wasn't struggling to stand. Jake wiped the blood from his lip and forced himself to stay upright. He couldn't fall. He wouldn't. "Stay down, kid," someone yelled from the crowd. But Jake wasn't listening. He had come too far to quit now. His body screamed at him to stop, to let the pain take over. But something deep inside refused to surrender. He gritted his teeth, took a shaky breath, and stepped forward. The referee glanced at him with uncertainty. "Are you sure you can continue?" Jake looked at his opponent, then at the championship trophy shining under the stadium lights. This was his dream. This was his moment. He squared his shoulders and nodded. And then his opponent charged at him with everything he had. It all started 3 years ago. Jake had never been the strongest, the fastest, or the most talented. In fact, most people didn't even notice him. He was just a quiet boy who sat in the back of the classroom, the kid who never quite fit in. That was until the day he watched his first boxing match on TV. He saw a fighter, beaten and bruised, stand up after every fall. He saw the way the crowd roared, the way the fighter refused to surrender no matter how much pain he was in. Jake had never seen anything like it before. Something sparked inside him that day. "Mom," he said at dinner that night, "I want to be a boxer." His mother, tired from working 2 jobs, sighed. "Jake, boxing is dangerous, and it's expensive, but I can do it," he insisted. "I know I can." She shook her head. "You're not strong enough, honey. Boxing is for tough kids." That stung. But Jake didn't argue. He just nodded, finished his food, and went to his room. That night, he stood in front of his mirror and clenched his fists. He imagined himself in the ring, fighting, winning. He had never been strong before. But maybe, just maybe, he could change that. The next morning, he woke up before the sun. He put on his old sneakers, stepped outside, and started running. He wasn't fast. He got tired quickly. His lungs burned. But he didn't stop. Every morning, he ran. Every afternoon, he did push-ups in his tiny bedroom. Every night, he shadowboxed in front of the mirror. At school, the bigger kids laughed. "Jake thinks he's going to be a boxer," one of them snorted. "More like a punching bag." He ignored them. One day, he found an old boxing gym on the other side of town. It was small, smelled like sweat, and had cracked walls, but it felt like home. The gym owner, Coach Ramirez, was a retired fighter with a gruff voice and a sharp eye. He watched as Jake awkwardly threw punches at a torn punching bag. "You ever boxed before, kid?" the coach asked. "No," Jake admitted, "but I want to learn." The coach chuckled. "You don't have the build for it. You sure about this?" Jake nodded. "I won't quit." Coach Ramirez studied him for a moment, then sighed. "All right, but if you miss one day of training, you're out." Jake never missed a day. At first, he was terrible. His punches were weak, his footwork was clumsy, and his arms ached after every session. But he kept going. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. His body changed. His arms got stronger. His reflexes got faster. And the bruises on his knuckles became badges of honor. He entered his first amateur fight a year later. It wasn't in a big arena, just a dusty old gym with a handful of spectators. His opponent was taller, stronger, and more experienced. Jake was nervous, but he remembered one thing: never give up. The bell rang. Jake fought with everything he had. He got knocked down twice, but he got back up. In the 3rd round, he landed a clean punch. His opponent staggered, and the crowd gasped. Jake saw his chance and didn't hesitate. He threw another punch, then another. He won. That was the first time people started noticing him. As the months went by, Jake kept training, kept fighting. He lost some matches, but he never let failure stop him. He learned from every mistake. And soon, he wasn't just another kid in the back of the classroom. He was a fighter. Now, 3 years later, he was standing in the biggest match of his life, the state championship, and he was losing. His opponent was bigger, stronger, and had knocked Jake down twice already. His body was battered, his muscles burned, and every breath felt like fire. But Jake wasn't the same kid he was 3 years ago. He wasn't weak anymore. He wasn't invisible. He was a fighter. So when his opponent came charging at him, Jake clenched his fists, steadied his stance, and prepared for the final round. Then, boom! A fist came flying straight at his face. The punch landed hard. Jake's head snapped back. His vision went white for a split second, and he felt his legs buckle. The impact sent him stumbling against the ropes. The crowd gasped. "Stay down, kid!" Someone shouted again. Jake could barely hear them. His ears rang, and his heartbeat pounded in his head like a drum. His opponent stepped back, arms raised, already celebrating. The referee stepped forward. 1, 2. Jake forced air into his lungs. The world around him felt like it was tilting, but deep inside, something refused to quit. 3, 4. The memories flooded his mind. Waking up before sunrise to run when no one believed in him. The hours of training, the blood, sweat, and pain. The countless times he had been knocked down, only to stand up again. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Jake gritted his teeth, planted his fists into the mat, and pushed himself up. 5, 6. His knees wobbled, but he forced them to hold. 7, 8. He took a deep breath and raised his fists. "I can still fight." The referee studied him for a second, then nodded and signaled for the match to continue. Jake's opponent frowned. He had expected the fight to be over. But Jake wasn't done yet. The crowd erupted. He was still standing. His opponent charged again, throwing another punch. This time, Jake was ready. He ducked, barely missing the blow, and countered with a sharp jab to the ribs. His opponent grunted in surprise. Jake didn't stop. He stepped in closer, moving faster than he had all fight. He threw another punch, and another. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting back. His opponent swung wildly, but Jake dodged. A sharp left hook, a right jab. The momentum was shifting. The energy in the stadium changed. Jake wasn't the underdog anymore. Then he saw his opening. His opponent dropped his guard for just a second. Jake didn't hesitate. He twisted his body, put every ounce of strength into his punch, and bam! His fist connected with his opponent's jaw. Time seemed to slow. The impact echoed in the arena. The bigger fighter's eyes widened. Then his legs gave out. He crashed to the mat. The crowd erupted. The referee rushed over. Jake stood there, chest heaving, watching as his opponent struggled to get up. 1, 2, 3. His opponent groaned, but his arms wouldn't move. 4, 5, 6. Jake's entire body ached. Sweat dripped from his forehead, mixing with the blood on his face. 7, 8, 9. The crowd held its breath. 10. The referee signaled. It was over. Jake had won. For a moment, he just stood there, too stunned to move. Then he heard the announcer's voice boom through the microphone, and the new state champion, Jake Miller. The stadium exploded in cheers. His coach ran into the ring, grabbing him by the shoulders. "You did it, kid." Jake's eyes stung, not from pain, but from something else. He looked at the trophy being carried toward him. He had dreamed of this moment. He had imagined it 1,000 times. And now it was real. He had proven them all wrong. As Jake held up the trophy, he thought back to the beginning. The first time he had ever stepped into the gym when he was just a scrawny kid with a dream. But his journey wasn't always filled with victories. There were days he wanted to quit. Days when the punches hurt too much, when his muscles screamed in protest, when the world told him he wasn't good enough. He thought about the toughest battle of his life, the moment that almost made him give up boxing forever. The night everything went wrong. That was the moment that had tested him the most. And that was where this journey truly began. 1 year earlier, the gym was nearly empty. The sound of a single punching bag being hit echoed through the walls. Jake was training harder than ever. His first real tournament was only weeks away, and he needed to be ready. He had no idea that by the time the night was over, everything would change. It started with a single mistake. He let his guard down during sparring. Just for a second. That was all it took. His opponent, a seasoned fighter, saw the opening and struck fast. Jake didn't even see the punch coming. Crack! Pain exploded in his jaw. His legs gave out. The world spun. He hit the mat, dazed. For the first time, he couldn't get up. His coach rushed over. "Jake, can you hear me?" The room felt like it was tilting. His mouth filled with the taste of blood. That night, in the hospital, the doctor gave him the worst news of his life. "Your jaw is fractured. You won't be able to fight for at least 6 months." Jake stared at him, the words not sinking in. 6 months? That was impossible. His tournament was in 3 weeks. His dreams, everything he worked for, was slipping away. The hospital room was cold, too quiet. The beeping of the machines was the only sound filling the air. Jake sat on the bed, staring blankly at the white walls. His jaw throbbed with a dull, constant pain, but it was nothing compared to the storm raging in his mind. 6 months. That was what the doctor said. 6 months of no training, no fighting, no tournament. His dream shattered. Coach stood beside him, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "We'll get through this, kid," he finally said. Jake clenched his fists. "No, we won't." He didn't say it out loud, but the thought screamed in his head. He had spent years preparing for this. The tournament was his chance to prove himself, to step out of the shadows of doubt and show the world what he was capable of. And now, it was over before it even began. He swallowed hard, but the lump in his throat wouldn't go away. Just then, the door swung open. Jake's mother rushed in, her face filled with worry. She wrapped him in a tight hug, careful not to touch his injured jaw. "Oh, sweetheart, are you okay?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. She pulled back, studying his face. "The doctor said you need rest and you have to." "I can't fight," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Her expression softened. "Honey, I know this is hard, but maybe it's for the best. Your body needs time to heal. You can always try again next year." Next year? That wasn't an option. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much. If he backed out now, people would say he wasn't strong enough, that he didn't have what it took, that he was just another kid with a dream too big to reach. His coach placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure something out." But Jake didn't believe him. For the first time in his life, he felt defeated. The weeks that followed were pure torture. Jake was forced to watch from the sidelines as his friends trained, sparred, and prepared for the tournament. The gym felt different now, like it didn't belong to him anymore. Every day, he sat there watching, knowing that if he hadn't made that one mistake, he would have been in the ring with them. The fire inside him was burning out. Then one night, as he sat alone in his room, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his coach. "Come to the gym. Now." Jake frowned. What was this about? It was already past midnight. Curious, and desperate for anything that could pull him out of his misery, he grabbed his hoodie and snuck out. The gym was dark when he arrived. The only light came from the ring in the center. And standing there, waiting, was Coach. "You think it's over, don't you?" Coach said as Jake walked in. Jake shoved his hands into his hoodie pocket. "Isn't it?" Coach smirked. "Not if you don't want it to be." Jake blinked. "I can't even train. You can't fight, but you can still prepare." Jake scoffed. "For what? The tournament is in a few weeks." Coach stepped forward. "So what? You think this is the last tournament that matters? You think one injury is enough to keep you down forever? Jake didn't answer. Coach pointed at the ring. You got knocked down, kid. Hard. But champions aren't made by how many times they win. They're made by how many times they get back up. Jake looked down. He wanted to believe that, but the doubt in his chest was heavy. Do you still want this? Coach asked. Jake hesitated. Then he clenched his fists. Yes. Then get to work. From that night on, Jake trained like never before. He couldn't spar, couldn't take hits, but that didn't stop him. He ran faster, pushed harder. He shadowboxed until his arms burned. He studied his past fights, learning from every mistake. He strengthened his footwork, his reflexes, his mind. And through it all, the fire inside him blazed back to life. But even as he trained, something else was happening. A new fighter had emerged at the gym, Brandon Tate. He was fast, strong, and ruthless. Jake watched him from the sidelines, taking in every move. Brandon was the favorite to win the tournament. No one could touch him. He moved like a machine, knocking out every opponent in his path. And Jake knew one day they would meet in the ring. But that day seemed far away. For now, Jake had only one goal, to prove that this wasn't the end. Then, just when things seemed to be getting better, something happened that threatened to take everything away from him again. It was late at night. The gym was empty. Jake was practicing alone when he heard the door creak open. He turned and his heart stopped. Brandon stood there, arms crossed, smirking. "I've been watching you," Brandon said, stepping forward. Jake tensed. "Yeah?" And Brandon chuckled. "It's funny. You used to be someone people talked about. Now, you're just a kid who almost had a shot." Jake's jaw tightened. Brandon stepped closer, voice lowering. "You should quit now. There's no coming back from this." Jake met his eyes. "We'll see." Brandon smirked. "No, we won't. Because you won't even make it to the next fight." Jake's fist clenched. Brandon's eyes darkened. "You should have stayed down, kid." And then he threw a punch. The punch came fast, too fast. Jake barely had time to react. Instinct kicked in and he ducked, feeling the air shift as Brandon's fist sailed past his head. His heart pounded. This wasn't a sparring session. This was real. Brandon smirked, already stepping forward again. "You still got some reflexes. Too bad they won't help you." Jake's fist clenched, but he didn't move. He wasn't cleared to fight. One wrong hit, and he could mess up his recovery for good. Brandon didn't care. Another punch came. This one connected. Jake stumbled back, pain exploding through his ribs. He gasped, but before he could recover, Brandon shoved him against the wall. "Stay down." Brandon's voice was low, dangerous. Jake's breathing was ragged. His jaw throbbed. His side burned, but something inside him refused to break. He wouldn't stay down. Brandon swung again. This time, Jake dodged. He didn't fight back. He just moved, slipping past every attack. Brandon was fast, but he was reckless, wasting energy with every missed hit. "You think running away makes you tough?" Brandon growled. Jake didn't answer. He just kept moving, watching, studying. Then, the door burst open. "Hey!" Coach's voice boomed through the gym. Brandon stepped back immediately, hands in the air like nothing had happened. Jake wiped his mouth, tasting blood. Coach stormed toward them, his face like thunder. "What the hell is going on?" Brandon shrugged. "Just saying hello to the injured kid." Jake's fist tightened. Coach turned to him. "You okay?" Jake nodded, even though pain pulsed through his side. Coach glared at Brandon. "Get out." Brandon smirked but didn't argue. As he walked past Jake, he leaned in and whispered, "This isn't over." Then he was gone. Coach turned back to Jake. "What happened?" Jake hesitated. He could tell the truth, but what would it change? Brandon was still the strongest fighter in the gym. He was still the favorite to win the tournament. And Jake? He was still broken. "I'm fine," he muttered. Coach studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up." The next few days were brutal. Jake trained harder than ever, pushing past the pain. His jaw still ached, his ribs were sore, but he didn't stop. Every night, he replayed the fight in his head. Brandon wasn't unbeatable. He was strong, sure, but he had weaknesses. He was aggressive, impatient. He attacked without thinking. Jake knew that if he had just one shot at him, he could win. But that was the problem. He didn't have a shot. He wasn't cleared to fight. The tournament was only weeks away, and unless a miracle happened, he would be stuck on the sidelines. Then the miracle happened. Coach called him into the office one evening. The room smelled like old leather and sweat. Papers were scattered across the desk. Coach sat behind it, arms crossed. Jake stood in front of him, nervous. Coach leaned back in his chair. "How bad do you want this?" Jake's stomach tightened. "More than anything." Coach nodded, then listened carefully. He slid a paper across the desk. Jake picked it up, and his eyes widened. It was a medical clearance form. His breath caught in his throat. How?" Coach smirked. "Doctor says if you take it easy for another week, you can start light training. You'll have to be smart, avoid hard hits. But if you prove you're ready, you're back in." Jake's heart pounded. This was it. His second chance. He swallowed hard. "When can I start?" Coach's eyes gleamed. "Tomorrow." Jake clenched his fists. It wasn't over. Not yet. But just as hope filled his chest, something happened that changed everything. The next morning, as he arrived at the gym, there was a crowd gathered around the bulletin board. People were whispering, pointing. Jake pushed through the crowd, and then he saw it. The tournament lineup. His name wasn't on the list. His heart dropped. He scanned the list again, eyes moving frantically. No mistake. He had been replaced. And the name in his spot, Brandon Tate. Jake's vision blurred. He wasn't just out of the tournament. Brandon had taken his place. Jake's hands curled into fists as he stared at the tournament list. His name was gone, just erased like he had never even been part of the competition. His stomach twisted as he read the name that had replaced his. Brandon Tate. Jake turned away from the board, his heart slamming against his ribs. The gym was buzzing with whispers. He caught bits of conversation. They really replaced him? Brandon must have pulled some strings. No way that's fair. Jake's chest burned. He had fought for this. He had trained through pain, through setbacks, through everything. And now, just when he was finally ready to come back, this? He stormed toward Coach's office, his breath short with frustration. The door was open, and Coach was sitting at his desk, rubbing his temples like he had already been through this fight 100 times in his head. Jake didn't even hesitate. "Why am I not on the list?" Coach sighed heavily and looked up, closed the door. Jake did. Then he folded his arms, waiting for an answer. Coach leaned forward, his face serious. "The board made a decision, Jake. They didn't want to take the risk." Jake's jaw tightened. "Risk? You were out for weeks," Coach said. "They're worried you're not at 100%. And Brandon, well, let's just say he had some people pushing for him." Jake felt something bitter rise in his throat. "This is bull." "Stop." Coach's voice was firm. "I get it. You're angry. You have every right to be. But the board isn't going to change their minds. Not now." Jake shook his head. This wasn't happening. "So that's it? All my training, all my work, just gone?" Coach hesitated. Then he leaned back in his chair, studying Jake carefully. "I didn't say that." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" Coach tapped his fingers against the desk. "Look, the official lineup is set. But if something happens, if a fighter drops out, you're the next in line." Jake's breath hitched. "So if Brandon..." Coach raised an eyebrow. "Not just Brandon. Anyone in your weight class. If someone gets injured or disqualified before the tournament starts, you get the spot. Hope flickered inside Jake, but he shoved it down. He couldn't sit around waiting for a miracle. He had to make one. The next week was torture. Jake trained harder than ever, even though his name wasn't on the list. Every morning, he pushed himself. Every night, he left the gym sore and exhausted. He watched Brandon, too. Brandon was cocky as always. He spent more time showing off than actually training. And the more Jake watched, the more he saw openings. Brandon was strong, sure, but he was sloppy. Jake just needed a shot. Then, 5 days before the tournament, it happened. Jake had just finished a brutal set of drills when he noticed a group of fighters crowded near the ring, whispering. Something was going on. He shoved through the crowd and froze. Brandon was on the mat, clutching his knee, his face twisted in pain. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. Coach was already there, kneeling beside Brandon, checking his leg. The gym was dead silent. Then, Coach stood up and turned to the crowd. His voice was calm, but his words sent a shock wave through the room. "He's out." Murmurs exploded around the gym. Brandon groaned. No, I can still." Coach shook his head. "You're done, Brandon. Torn ligament. You're not fighting." Brandon cursed under his breath, slamming his fist against the mat. Jake swallowed hard. This was it. Coach glanced toward him, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to the fighters. "Since Brandon's out, we need a replacement." Jake could barely breathe. Coach's next words changed everything. Jake Morgan stepped forward. A rush of adrenaline shot through Jake's body. He took a step forward, trying to stay calm, but his heart was about to burst out of his chest. Coach met his eyes. "You still want this?" Jake didn't even hesitate. "Yes." Coach nodded. "Then welcome back to the tournament." The gym erupted into cheers, but Jake barely heard them. He was in. After everything, after the injury, after Brandon stealing his spot, after weeks of thinking it was over, he was back. But as he turned, he caught Brandon's glare from the mat. His face was dark with rage, his hands clenched into fists. Jake had his spot, but Brandon wasn't done with him. Not by a long shot. The first punch came out of nowhere. Jake barely had time to react before Brandon's fist slammed into his ribs, knocking the breath from his lungs. He stumbled back, gasping. The locker room was empty except for the two of them, and the sound of Brandon's heavy breathing filled the space. Jake clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stand tall. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Brandon stepped closer, his eyes burning with fury. "You think you deserve that spot?" His voice was low, dangerous. "You think you can just take what's mine?" Jake exhaled sharply, his ribs throbbing. "I didn't take anything. You got yourself injured." Brandon grabbed Jake's shirt, yanking him forward. "You should have stayed out of this." Jake's hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Fighting here now wouldn't change anything." Brandon's lip curled. "I'll be watching. And when you fail, I'll be right there to remind you that you never should have come back." He shoved Jake backward and stormed out. Jake stood there, his chest rising and falling, his heart hammering. Brandon wasn't just angry. He was looking for revenge. Jake buried himself in training, blocking everything else out. The tournament was 3 days away. He couldn't afford distractions. Not Brandon, not his doubts, not anything. His workouts were brutal. He pushed himself past exhaustion, sharpening his movements, strengthening his core. Every punch, every kick, every block. It all had to be perfect. But late at night, when the gym was empty, the fear crept in. What if I'm not ready? What if I fail? Every time those thoughts surfaced, he fought them off the same way, by reminding himself why he started. Because quitting was never an option. The night before the tournament, the weight of it all settled on his shoulders. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his body aching from training. The memories of his last fight played in his mind. The moment he got injured, the months of recovery, the crushing disappointment, and then a new image, Brandon smirking, waiting for him to fail. Jake sat up, his chest tight. No, this wasn't just about proving something to the judges. This was about proving something to himself. Tomorrow, he wasn't just going to fight. He was going to win. The arena buzzed with energy. Jake stood in the locker room, wrapping his hands, his heart pounding in his ears. Outside, the crowd cheered as another match finished. His turn was coming. The door swung open and Coach walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just watched as Jake tightened the wrap around his wrist. Then, finally, he spoke. "You ready for this?" Jake met his gaze. More than ever. Coach studied him for a second, then nodded. Good. He stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Jake's shoulder. Remember, don't fight their fight. Make them fight yours. Jake inhaled deeply, letting those words settle. Outside, the announcer's voice echoed through the arena. And now, stepping into the ring, Jake Morgan. The locker room door opened. The arena lights blazed. This was it. Jake stepped out, the roar of the crowd shaking the air. As he climbed into the ring, his opponent was already waiting. A fighter with sharp, calculating eyes. A fighter who had never lost. A fighter who wanted to end Jake's comeback before it even started. Jake locked eyes with him. The referee raised his hand. Fighters ready? Jake's fist tightened. The bell rang. The air inside the weigh-in room was thick with tension. Jake stood face to face with Damien, his longtime rival. The same man who had humiliated him in the ring before. The same man who had once sent him crashing to the mat, doubting if he would ever rise again. But today was different. Jake met Damien's gaze with unwavering focus. He wasn't the same fighter he had been months ago. The doubt, the hesitation, the fear, all gone. The crowd of journalists, trainers, and boxing officials watched in silence as the two fighters locked eyes, neither willing to look away. Damien smirked. "I hope you trained hard, kid," he whispered under his breath. "Because this time, I'm not holding back." Jake didn't flinch. He just clenched his fists at his sides and replied, "Neither am I." The room erupted in flashes of cameras and murmurs of anticipation. The fight was set. Tomorrow night, under the bright lights, Jake would step back into the ring to prove that he was more than just an underdog. He was a warrior. The next morning, Jake arrived at the stadium early. His coach had drilled into him that preparation wasn't just physical. It was mental. He sat in the locker room, wrapping his hands with steady fingers, listening to the distant sounds of the crowd gathering outside. "Tonight, you fight like a champion," his coach said, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Not just for the title, but for yourself." Jake nodded. He closed his eyes, visualizing every movement, every punch, every counter he had trained for. His heart was pounding, but not from fear, from excitement. This was his moment. The stadium was electric. Thousands of fans cheered, chanting names, the excitement buzzing through the air. The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers, calling both fighters to the ring. Jake climbed through the ropes, his muscles tight with anticipation. Across from him, Damien paced like a caged predator, his grin full of confidence. The referee brought them together in the center of the ring. No cheap shots. No fouls. Fight hard. Fight clean. The bell rang. The first round was brutal. Damien came at him fast, throwing heavy jabs and hooks that forced Jake on the defensive. But Jake was prepared. He moved with precision, dodging and countering, making Damien work for every inch of ground. The crowd roared with each exchange. By the third round, Jake started to find his rhythm. He landed a solid uppercut that snapped Damien's head back. For the first time, his opponent looked surprised. Jake smirked. "Didn't see that coming, did you?" But Damien wasn't done yet. With a sudden burst of speed, he launched a vicious right hook. Jake saw it too late. The punch landed square on his jaw, sending him stumbling backward. The world spun as he crashed into the ropes, struggling to keep his balance. The referee began counting. 1, 2, 3. Jake blinked, shaking his head to clear the fog. He saw Damien standing in the center of the ring, arms raised, already celebrating. 4, 5. The noise of the crowd blurred around him. His breath came in ragged gasps. 6, 7. Jake planted his gloves on the mat, pushing himself up. 8. With a deep breath, he forced himself to his feet. The referee checked his balance, then nodded. Fight! The crowd exploded, but Damien's face darkened. He had expected Jake to stay down. Not this time. Jake hit the mat hard. For a moment, the world spun. The taste of blood filled his mouth. The crowd's roar became a distant hum, like he was sinking underwater. Get up. His opponent, Lucas, stood over him, fists clenched, breathing steady. No mercy in his eyes. No hesitation. The referee's voice cut through the fog. 1, 2, 3. Jake groaned, blinking rapidly. His arms felt like lead. His ribs burned. 4, 5, 6. He clenched his jaw. He wasn't done. With a growl, Jake pushed himself up, legs wobbling. But he refused to fall again. The referee stepped back, nodding. The match continued. Lucas smirked. Should have stayed down. Jake exhaled sharply. Not in my nature. Lucas came in fast, too fast. This time, Jake was ready. He dodged, barely avoiding the strike, and countered with a solid punch to Lucas's ribs. It wasn't enough to drop him, but it was enough to show Jake wasn't finished. Not yet. The second round was brutal. Lucas was stronger, faster, more experienced. Jake was battered, bruised, but he refused to give up. He blocked when he could, absorbed the blows when he couldn't. He watched, studied, waited. Lucas had a pattern. He relied on power, looking for a knockout. He swung big. If Jake could just... There. Lucas launched a right hook, expecting Jake to go left. But instead, Jake ducked and came up with a devastating uppercut. The impact sent Lucas staggering backward. The crowd exploded. Jake pressed forward. Jab, jab, cross. Each hit landed clean. For the first time, Lucas looked unsure. Jake saw his chance. He pivoted, twisting his hips, putting everything he had left into one final punch. His fist crashed into Lucas's jaw. Lucas stumbled. His legs buckled. And then he fell. The ref rushed forward. 1, 2, 3. The crowd held its breath. 4, 5, 6. Lucas groaned, trying to push himself up. 7, 8, 9. His arms shook. 10. The referee waved his arms. Knockout. Jake Morgan wins. Jake dropped to his knees, gasping for breath. He did it. After everything, the injury, the doubt, the fear, he had won. Back in the locker room, Jake sat on the bench, ice pressed to his ribs. The adrenaline was fading, and the pain was creeping in. Coach stepped in, arms crossed. Not bad, kid. Jake grinned through the pain. Not bad. Coach smirked. All right, fine. That was damn impressive. Jake leaned back, exhaling. The victory felt unreal. The door creaked open. Brandon stood there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Brandon walked in, arms crossed, leaning against the wall. Didn't think you had it in you, he admitted. Jake looked up. Guess you were wrong. Brandon let out a breath, almost a laugh. Maybe. He pushed off the wall, hesitating. You proved me wrong tonight. I can respect that. Jake didn't expect that. Brandon turned to leave, then stopped at the door. See you at the next one. And just like that, he was gone. Jake sat there, shaking his head with a tired smile. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Jake knew he had to make his move. The rounds had been brutal, but he had endured. Sweat dripped from his face. His body screamed with exhaustion, but he refused to slow down. Damien's punches were growing sloppy. He was powerful, but Jake had speed. He had endurance. He had will. And in the 8th round, he saw his opening. Damien swung a wild left hook. Too wide, too slow. Jake ducked, pivoted on his heel, and delivered a devastating counterpunch to Damien's ribs. The impact sent shockwaves through his opponent's body. Damien staggered, clutching his side. His breathing labored. Jake didn't stop. He threw a sharp right hook, catching Damien on the chin. The crowd erupted as Damien stumbled backward. He looked dazed, his legs wobbling. The bell rang, end of the round. Damien slumped into his corner, his trainer frantically yelling instructions. Jake returned to his side of the ring, his coach grinning at him. "He's breaking," his coach whispered. "One more round like that and he's done." Jake nodded, breathing deep, centering himself. One more round. One final push. The 9th round started, and Jake wasted no time. He pressed forward, jabbing, dodging, keeping Damien on the defensive. The once arrogant fighter was now desperate, swinging wildly just to stay in the fight. Jake saw the final opening. He stepped in, feinted left, and then drove an explosive right uppercut straight into Damien's chin. Time seemed to slow. Damien's eyes widened in shock. His body tilted backward. And then he crashed onto the mat. The stadium erupted. The referee rushed forward, beginning the count. 1, 2, 3. Jake stood in the center of the ring, breathless, watching. 4, 5, 6. Damien's fingers twitched. He groaned, trying to push himself up. 7, 8. Jake clenched his fists. "Stay down." 9. Damien collapsed back onto the mat, his body giving out. 10. The referee waved his arms, knockout. The stadium erupted in deafening cheers. The announcer's voice boomed across the speakers. Winner by knockout, Jake Marshall. Jake dropped to his knees, overwhelmed. He had done it. After everything, after every fall, every failure, he had won. But the real victory wasn't just in the fight. It was in the fact that he had never given up. The arena was electric. The crowd's cheers shook the walls, but Jake barely heard them. His heart pounded like a war drum, his body screaming in pain, yet he stood tall. Across from him, Lucas glared. This wasn't just a rematch. It was a war. The referee stepped forward. Final round. Fighters ready. Jake nodded. Lucas smirked. Dang! Lucas came in like a storm, throwing a brutal right hook. Jake dodged, barely missing the impact. He countered with a jab, but Lucas blocked and slammed a knee into Jake's ribs. Pain erupted through his body. Jake staggered but didn't fall. He couldn't fall. Not now. Lucas charged again, throwing rapid punches, each one landing harder than the last. Jake's vision blurred. His legs felt weak. Then he heard it. A voice. "Get up, Jake. Never give up." It was Coach. Jake sucked in a deep breath. No, not today. Not ever. Lucas swung. This time, Jake saw it coming. He ducked, countered. A solid punch to Lucas's gut. Lucas gasped. Jake pressed forward. Left, right, uppercut. Lucas stumbled. Now, finish it. Jake twisted his body, putting everything he had into one final strike. His fist connected with Lucas's jaw. Lucas's body went limp. He collapsed. The referee moved in. 1, 2, 3. The crowd counted along. 4, 5, 6. Jake's breath was ragged. His hands trembled. 7, 8, 9. Lucas didn't move. 10. Knockout. The crowd erupted. Jake fell to his knees, gasping for air. He won. An hour later, Jake sat in the locker room, staring at the championship belt beside him. Coach leaned against the wall. "You did it." Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Yeah." Brandon stepped in. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at Jake, then at the belt. Finally, he nodded. "You earned it." Jake smirked. You doubted me? Brandon chuckled. Not anymore. Jake exhaled, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He had fought. He had struggled. He had failed. But he never gave up. And that made all the difference.